Well, another good Sunday morning to you folks. Thank you so much for tuning in this morning for another Bible class session as we continue to take a look at our Sermon on the Mount. If you happen to be joining us for the first time, thanks for joining us. Hope you'll be glad that you did. Hope you'll want to come back and be with us anytime that you can. Well, we're in Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to wind up Matthew chapter 5 today. That doesn't mean we're winding up the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 constitute the Sermon on the Mount. We're finishing the first chapter. Our next time together, we'll begin with chapter 6. But first, let's finish up chapter 5. So Matthew chapter 5 is where you want to be. Verse 43 is where you want to start. And we're going to take a look at verses 43 through 48 as we look at the last of the 6 illustrations that Jesus is using to contrast the false righteousness of the Pharisees with the true righteousness of God. Remember in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20, Jesus said, "Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees," the scribes and Pharisees. That model, we've talked about that model. We have to practice greater righteousness than the model of the Pharisees, the model of obedience that they demonstrated, which was partial, it was external, and it was self-centered. And so after he told us that, then he gets into these 6 illustrations to show us what greater righteousness is. That started with verse 21 of Matthew chapter 5, and it goes all the way now through verse 48. The first illustration was murder. The second one was adultery. The third one was divorce. The next one was integrity and honesty. And the last one that we looked at is how we respond to others. Well, what we're going to look at tonight is basically an extension of that 5th illustration, how we respond to others. And let's just begin by reading it as we always do. So verse 43, let's take a look. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For He causes His sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore you are to be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Okay, let's take a look at this. He begins here in verse 43, just like he did with most of these illustrations, at least in 4 out of the 5 that we've already looked at. He begins by directly quoting from the Old Testament. "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Now, the hate your enemy part, that's not actually in the Old Testament, but the love your neighbor, that is. It's from Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18. It was very important for the people of Israel to love their neighbor. Okay, so what does that mean? That is, not love, we'll get to that in a second. But first of all, who is the neighbor? How did most Jews understand that word, neighbor? Well, for most Jews, it was understood, one's neighbor was understood to be a fellow Jew, a fellow Israelite. And so they took the word neighbor, and in their mind, one's neighbor had ethnic boundaries. It was everyone within that ethnic boundary. It was my fellow Jew. It was my fellow Israelite. And so to the Jewish mind, they heard, when God said, love your neighbor, they heard, love your fellow Jew. Love your fellow Israelite. Now, the second part of this in verse 43, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. The hate your enemy, again, that's not there. That's not a quote from the Old Testament. But it does obviously reflect a widespread belief among the Jews in Jesus' day. And the reasoning seems to go like this. Well, if we are to love our fellow Jew, if we are to love our fellow Israelite, if God commands us to do that, love this person, Well, the implication is we don't have to love that person. So if we're told to love this person, it excludes the rest of the people. And so love your fellow Israelite and hate everyone else. Now it's important to understand, though, what Jesus means by hate and how the Jews understood the word hate. It's, when we use that word, it's pretty restricted in its use. It's pretty limited. When we say hate, we mean hate. I mean, we have this, we mean it in the sense of this real positive hatred, a strong, intense feeling of ill will or dislike for something or someone. That's what the word hate means to us. But that's not always what it meant to the Jew. Hate was often used as an idiom simply to mean to love less. Now, there are a lot of places that we could go in the Bible where we could see that idiom at work. But let me just show you one place. Turn over to John chapter 12. It's the one verse that we will look at that will show you what I'm talking about. John chapter 12. When you get there, look down at about verse 25. John chapter 12, verse 25, Jesus says, "He who loves his life loses it, but he who hates his life in this world will keep it to eternal life." He who hates his life. Now again, that doesn't mean this strong feeling of ill will or dislike. You don't have a strong feeling of ill will or dislike for your life. And that's not what God's intended, Jesus means here in John chapter 12 and verse 25. Again, this was often used as idiomatically. It's a Hebrew idiom that just means you prefer one thing over another. And so what Jesus says here in John chapter 12 and verse 25 is we have to prefer Jesus over everything else. We have to prefer Him over our family. We have to prefer Him over our goals. We have to prefer Him over our desire. We have to prefer Him over everything. So hate is often used in that sense. And I think that's the way hate is being used here. So that what Jesus is saying is this. You've always understood that you are to care about the well-being of your fellow Israelite, your ethnic brothers, and that you're not to care so much about the well-being of other people outside the ethnic boundaries. That's what Jesus is saying. You are to be concerned about, you are to have your fellow Israelites' best interest at heart. But God doesn't expect you to have the best interest of other people at heart. And so, just as Jesus has done with all these other prevailing views that we've looked at about murder and adultery and divorce and honesty, just as He does with all these other prevailing views, He absolutely smashes this prevailing view as well. He says, "But I say to you," there in verse 44, "I say to you, love your enemies." I say to you, this is God's definitive will for His people. For subjects of His kingdom, the care that we demonstrate toward our brothers and sisters is to be extended to everyone else as well. Our care, our concern for another's well-being, in other words, is not to have any boundaries at all. No ethnic boundaries or any other boundaries. Our concern for other people and their well-being is to be non-discriminatory. It is to be all-embracing. Our concern for the well-being of others is to have no class boundaries, no racial boundaries, no ethnic boundaries, no social boundaries, no economic boundaries, or any other boundary. Love is to seek the eternal well-being of every single person, even those who seek to inflict some kind of harm on us. That's what he's talking about when he talks about our enemies. Now, when Jesus said this, his audience had to be startled. It really had to just rock them. Of course, he's already been rocking them all the way through this. Everything that he has said has rocked their world. But boy, this one here had to just absolutely just hit them between the eyes and startled them. He was probably saying something that they had never, ever, ever entertained in their life. And as I said earlier, it's really an extension of what Jesus has already said in verses 38 through 42. There, as we saw Wednesday night, he was dealing with how we relate to other people in various circumstances. And we talked about 4 different kinds of circumstances there. And so he's dealing with the same thing here in verses 43 through 48. He's dealing with how we relate to others. Now, to really fully understand and appreciate what Christ is saying here, we need to make sure that we understand 2 expressions that Jesus uses. The first thing that we need to understand, the first expression we need to make sure we understand to fully appreciate what Jesus is talking about, is to understand what he means by enemies. What does he mean? Does he mean someone who is a persecutor of the church? We were told in the Beatitudes to pray for those that persecute us. That he's saying that our attitude toward religious persecution has to go beyond non-retaliation and has to actually embrace a genuine concern for that person. Well, a persecutor would definitely fall into that category. Religious persecutors definitely fit this category of enemies. But I know that Jesus isn't limiting his understanding of enemies, his intent for that word enemies, to religious persecution. That is making that word far too narrow. It is restricting that word far beyond what Jesus intends. So what is an enemy? What does Jesus have in mind? Well, most of the time, the people that Jesus has in mind when he uses the word enemies there, most of the time they're just ordinary people that we interact with every single day of our lives. It is anyone who is antagonistic toward us at any time or in any circumstance of our life. It might be a person at work. It might be a person at school. It might be a person at church. It might be a person even at home who just seems to publicly humiliating us with insults, or they just seem to speak to us in a condescending and patronizing way. It might be that person at school or at work or at church or at home who just seems to always be misrepresenting us and maybe smearing our reputation. It may be malicious, but it may not be malicious, but it's done nevertheless. It may be that person at work or that person at school who just treats you differently, it seems, than everyone else who's around. It's not that they're openly ugly toward you. It just may be something as simple as, they're always doing nice things for everyone around you, except you. It may be something like that. To you, they're just woodenly polite at best. Or it may be that person at work. It may be that person at school. It may be that person at church. It may be that person at home who just refuses to pull his or her share of the load, and the burden just always falls on you to do everything. It may be a fellow employee. It may be a business opponent who seems like they would do anything to gain an advantage for themselves. even something unprincipled, even something to your detriment. It may be a boss or a fellow employee that you just can't seem to please. They just seem to have no patience, no understanding toward anyone who fails to live up to their standards in anything. Or they don't take anyone else into consideration. They just seem to be consumed with their own wants and their own needs and their own feelings. Or maybe they have this short fuse and they're always blowing up and saying downright mean things to you. That's who we're talking about here. Maybe it's that acquaintance that just, for whatever reason, they just seem to think they're better than you and better than anyone else. It may be that person that you're always butting heads with, that always seems to disagree with you about everything. Religion, politics, whatever. It may be your husband or it may be your wife that you seem to always be in constant conflict with. Maybe your children or your parents that you seem to always be in constant conflict with. It may be a spiteful neighbor. It may be a fellow church member. It may be a political foe, a social antagonist. I think you get the picture here, what we're trying to say. When Jesus uses that word enemy, He's not just talking about religious persecutors. He's not just talking about someone in a different uniform on a battlefield. He's talking about anyone that we just don't like to be around, because when we're around them, our experience is usually anything but pleasurable. That's who he's talking about here. Okay, so now that we understand what Jesus has in mind by enemies, let's now talk about this other idea of love. What does he mean when he says we need to love our enemies? How do I love my antagonists? Well, I'm guessing that most people who are watching this right now know that in the Greek language there are a variety of words that we use to translate love. And, there is agape, and there's phileo, and there is eros, and off the top of my head, I'm blanking on the fourth. But there's a variety of terms. And so we need to understand what word is being used here. Is he talking about phileo, the love of the kind of love that exists within a family? Is he talking about eros, the kind of love that exists between a husband and a wife, a man and a woman? No, he uses the word here, agape, and it's the word the word for love that is most often used in the New Testament. And that word, let me just remind you, I know most of you know this, that word basically means to have another one's best interest at heart. And so it's really important to understand that's what it means. When he says love our enemies, it means have their best interest at heart. Have a genuine concern for their well-being. In other words, it's not a demand, when he says love, it is not a demand to have warm fuzzies about them. Listen, it is hard to have warm fuzzies about those who antagonize you. It really is. But God's not commanding you to have warm fuzzies for them. The demand is to have their best interest at heart. The demand is to act good for them on their behalf. So God calls us, you say, well, that's not natural. Yeah, I know it's not natural. God often calls us to go against the natural. He asks us to embrace the supernatural, the God dimension of things. And so he is calling on us then for all of our antagonists to really genuinely have their best interest at heart. Well, how do I do that? Okay, we've looked at this passage before, but I want to look at it again because it fits perfectly and beautifully. In fact, it really needs to always be looked at as anytime you look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48, you also need to look at Luke chapter 6, verse 27 and 28. Luke chapter 6, verse 27 and 28. This is Luke's parallel of Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48. And what Luke does here, he gives us 3 manifestations of love. So how do we love our antagonists? How do we demonstrate that we genuinely are concerned about their well-being? Well, take a look at it here, verse 27 and verse 28. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Now here we go. Here's how that's manifested. Do good to those who hate you. In other words, do good to your antagonist. You know, you say, well, I don't retaliate against them. Well, that's good. That's the first step. We already looked at that in the Sermon on the Mount. Don't retaliate. But now we learn that's not enough. Now you're ready, though. If you're not retaliating, now you're ready for step 2. Do something good for them. Listen, it's a lot easy. It's not easy, but it's easier to refrain from doing something bad back to them. Okay, I can get there. But now Jesus takes it to this next level. That's a lot harder than that. Actually do good for them. In other words, if you discover that they have a need, hey, do it. Do it. If they have a need, if they're sick, reach out to them. Maybe they have a loved one in the hospital. Send them a card. Give them a call. Let them know that you're thinking about them. Let them know that you're praying for them. They're behind on a project, maybe. Hey, offer to help. Hey, you bring lunch in to this group of colleagues at work. Don't leave them out. Include them as well. That's the idea of doing good. So again, it's taking that non-retaliation to the next step. Okay, back to Luke 6. So that's the first way that we love our enemies. We actually do something good for them. Now look at the second one. Luke chapter 6, verse 28. Bless those who curse you. Bless those who curse you. Literally, bless your antagonists. The word here literally means to speak well of them. Don't slander them. Look, they slander you. They may curse you, and you choose to honor your commitment to Jesus Christ, and you don't slander back. That's great. But now Jesus says, take it to the next level. And that is, you speak well of them, and you speak well to them. That's what it means to bless your antagonists. Your words to them are to be kind. You don't talk in ways to tear them down. Your words build up. Your words don't hurt. When encouragement is needed, encourage them. You know, they worked hard on a project. Praise them. The project was rejected. Encourage them. When praise is deserved, praise them. Congratulations on your promotion. Hey, listen, I wanted to want to commend you on how you handled that. Those words to your antagonists. You don't just live in quiet isolation, not slandering them back. When opportunities arise, speak well of them and to them. You know, that reminds me when you're trying to say something good to somebody or well to somebody, it reminds me that, some people actually need some instructions on how to do this because they're awful at it. They will take try to give someone a compliment and turn it into an insult. Hey, listen, wow, that shirt looks nice on you. It's not my style, but boy, it looks good on you. That's awful. That says, man, you have rotten taste, but it looks good on you. Don't cancel out a positive with a negative. speak well of. That's what speaking well to them. But not just that, speak well to them. Don't speak one way to their face and then speak another way behind their back. You don't make things up and paint a picture of them that really doesn't exist. Commend them, commend things in them to other people. People say, look, if you don't find anything worthy of commendation, then don't commend at all. Well, maybe if you haven't found anything worthy of commendation, maybe we just need to look harder and find some way to bless them. Speak well of them and speak well to them. And then back to Luke chapter 6. So, okay, how else are we to love? So we're to actually do good. That not just don't insult back, but actually do something good for them. And we are to not just refrain from saying anything negative about them. We're to bless them. We're to actually speak well of them to others and to them personally. And now look at the next one. Verse 28, Luke 6. Bless those who curse you and pray for those who mistreat you. Hey, put your antagonist. Do you have an antagonist? If you do, are they on your prayer list? They should be. That's what Jesus wants us to do here. Put them on our prayer list. Again, it may be that spiteful neighbor. It may be that social antagonist. It may be a devious business opponent. It may be a hypercritical spouse. It may be those hard-to-take in-laws. But praying for them. Hey, remember, I just recently talked about Stephen in Acts 7 and verse 60, where he is praying for those who are stoning him. Don't forget Jesus in Luke chapter 23 and verse 34, as iron spikes are being literally driven through his body, he says, Father, forgive them. Wow. As someone has said, if the cruel torture of crucifixion couldn't silence our Lord's prayer for His enemies, what pain could possibly justify the silencing of our prayers for our enemies? The guy who said that was actually a commentator by the name of John Stott. It's a great, great thought to have. Well, that's the divine pattern right there. When you live like this, you're not living like the Pharisees. When you live like this, you're living like God Himself, who dispenses good without any kind of discrimination. That's the point that God's making back in Matthew chapter 5. Take a look real quickly back at that. That's what He means when He tells us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Look at verse 45. So that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. God does good for both good and evil people. We are like God when we do this. Citizens of the kingdom, that's you, that's me. We have to have a higher standard of love. And we have to have a higher standard of righteousness than the rest of the world. Look, we see the world. We see their standards of love. We see their standards of righteousness. And it can be cruel and vicious. Our standards would be much more different. We're to be more honest. We're to be more considerate. We're to be more helpful. We're to be more caring as we exhibit divine love. God's character has to be our standard. Well, thanks for joining me for Bible class today. And that brings us to the end of chapter 5. But like I said, not the end of the Sermon on the Mount. So the next time that we're together, we begin chapter 6. In the meantime, I hope everyone is well. Have a great rest of the day. Lord willing, I'll see you soon. Take care.